from California, we have Dr. Jade Power Sotomayor. Walk up. She is a performance studies professor, bombera extraordinaire. Tap in.
I'm so excited to be here at, in the Mecca of Puerto Rican Studies. My West Coast heart is happy. Are you tired of talking about Bad Bunny yet? Quieren más. Dancing in non-English at the Grammys. ¿Todo el mundo habla español? ¿Todo el mundo de Puerto Rico? No. Thus, Benito greeted us, and by way of these rhetorical but clearly to him significant questions, interpolated us into the rehearsal space. Sí, we resoundingly responded. En tu casa. Claro, someone else called out as he circled the interior of the warehouse studio, long strides propelling and activating him, while his eyes, peering out from under his cap, darted around the room, quickly shifting his gaze lest it be caught anywhere too long. We had arrived earlier that day to stage our participation in the Grammy performance that would take place in just 4 days. The group included a whole crew de la isla, 5 planeros, it really should have been more, 8 members of the inimitable and invaluable veteran street theater group Agua Sol y Sereno, and 8 plena dancers, a couple of whom had flown the night before from the west coast of Puerto Rico, and the rest of us who were practitioners of Puerto Rican folklore, broadly conceived, in the Southern California area. I happened to be one of them, and I was still in disbelief that somehow all those years of bomba study and community making had brought me into the same room as the guy whose Diles and Creepy Kush had been the emo soundtrack to a short period living in cold, dark, and rainy Seattle, the furthest I have ever felt from Puerto Rico, both in terms of distance and culture. As a scholar of Puerto Rican performance, a dance theorist and cultural critic, I relished the close-up embodied insights, and as a diasporican, I welcomed the chance to sentir ese único calor de la isla, the creative process of culture making that was the engine of our junte, what brought me there that day and what brings me here today. I also knew that in addition to all the fanaticada watching on Sunday, there were people, my teachers, elders, community members, who would be watching closely as the particularities of these vernacular sounds and embodiments so fundamental to Puerto Rico's Caribeñidad, so closely and meticulously cared for by the Black stewards of these Black traditions, this cultura callejera that would make its debut on a global stage. The sonic embodiments of reggaeton have long been circulating outside the bounds of the local cultures that birthed them, but plena, no tanto. The pressure was on and the stakes were high. When we got there that day, the dancers didn't really know what to expect. Maybe that he had wanted a comparsa-like procession, estilo la fiesta de la calle San Sebastián. Someone had said that we'd be entering to el apagón. But my main question was, what exactly did they mean by plena dancers? Even if at times we appeared in different call sheets as the bomba y plena dancers. Aside from choreography staged as single numbers and a large grouping of theatricalized folkloric representations, plena dancing is for the most part social and consists of 2 or 3 paso básico that are varyingly interchanged. In other words, plena dancing, different from the oft conflated and much, much older bomba, is really about moving along to and accompanying plena music. Played on hand drums, plena has long defined Puerto Rican street culture and as such protest cultures, as it is portable and perfect for processions, making a Rican pride ruckus at sporting events, and taking Boricua de pura cepa demands to the streets. The other burning question we had was, who would be choreographing, directing us? Did they know anything about plena? More importantly, about the ambientes that comprise it, indeed, the ambiente Benito was looking to conjure with its presence. A night before search of the choreographer whose name appeared in the emails and whose impressive resume boasted, among other things, Karol G music videos, raised even more questions. We later would understand that we were on different pages, realizing that while she kept trying to count us in with a 5, 6, 7, 8 on the recording shared with us as a guide, our confusion was quickly resolved by talking to the musicians, who told us that it was a pa-ka-dum-kum-pa-pa. Not to mention the disorientation experienced when in trying to amp us up as we prepared to enter, she kept yelling out to us, "Con sabor! But finally, of course, we wanted to know, what would we be wearing? Benito arrived to the rehearsal earlier than expected that evening, and though we were still getting fitted for costumes, they rushed us along so we could start the run-through of what we had been working on earlier. This was, of course, the moment we had all been waiting for, but the timing wasn't great because emotions were high precisely because we had just been informed of what we would be wearing. It was what some of us had perhaps feared, but never imagined possible, ill-fitting clothes bought at the local folklorico store in downtown LA that serves the rich culture of the many Mexican ballet folklorico groups that have for decades been key sites for the performance of Mexicanness and a celebration of Mexico's diverse and varied regional cultures. For those of us in Southern California, we were not unfamiliar with the ignorance of this conflation and slippage. For the dancers from Puerto Rico, they were disoriented and dismayed. The woman hired to do wardrobe was visibly confused, and no one agreed about the solution. Some, trained to uphold the genre's respectability by the sartorial verisimilitude to the folklorized mid-century look of off-the-shoulder blouses, just below the knee-length skirt, and hair with multiple flowers, went so far as to arrange for dresses to be flown from Puerto Rico before Sunday. This is Wednesday night. Others, realizing how staid concepts of tradition that was being instrumentalized at the same time that it was being grossly misrepresented, suggested that perhaps we could imagine a look that was less immediately specific to the aesthetics of Mexican ballet folklorico. After all, we had already determined that they were asking for a movement repertoire requiring more extended arms, projecting visibility and space-taking that's not like the plena dancing is really more close to your body. Because remember, this is a live performance, right? As well as a televised performance, a live performance for thousands in the crypto arena. And as such, would require a somewhat longer skirt than that traditionally used for plena. Though the costume issue would consume much conversation and time over the coming days, upon Benito's arrival, we put aside our questions and joined the group to rehearse the performance. By this point, we realized that an important part of our presence in the performance would be animando el público, bailando merengue, powered by the incredible amarre and sonic resonance of Diangela Pechao and his crew. Breathless and sweaty, finding the right moments to menear la cintura with a larger-than-life Tego, or Roberto Clemente, or even a characteristically proper Doña Fela, we ran it again and again and again. When everyone asked me later, well, how was it? My report was, at the end of the day, it was a rehearsal. We rehearsed. There's a lot more storytelling, reflection, and analysis I can share about this experience, about how this performance followed in Benito's practice, as we've been discussing, of placing his artistry within a genealogy of Puerto Rican expressive cultures, while also situating plena within the dance languages of mambo merengue and the norm-breaking perreo. How the citation of plena called upon its capacity for marking claims to an authentic past and encapsulating a contemporary cultura callejera. Perhaps in the Q&A, or catch me after. But in my remaining time, I wish to highlight a couple key points in relation to Bad Bunny, perreo, and Caribbean dancing more generally. The context of our presence, the plena, the cabezudos, at the Grammys in relation to the song El Apagón, which opened the piece, which, unlike, say, a song like Latinoamérica by Calle 13, is about the specifics of Puerto Rican colonialism and those who call it out for what it is. Cuidado con mi corillo que somos un montón. No me digas. While we were simultaneously relieved and disappointed that he wouldn't be sitting La Chocha de Puerto Rico on national television, the opening with this song is nonetheless a reference to the sentiment therein. The rhythmic chant, repetition from earlier, both invokes a motherland and a sexual entrega to Puerto Rican pussies, but it also names the kinds of extraction wrought by investors and gentrifiers that see Puerto Rico as a port opening to exploitable riches. In his work at the Grammys and in his last concert tour more generally, he staged a dancing that exceeds and refuses outward-facing proscenium choreography. The salsa at the Coachella is an exception, drawing on rich vernacular dance languages that nonetheless reflect virtuosity, rhythmic complexity, and physical dexterity. As such, this staging aims to replicate the sociality at the core of Caribbean music and movement cultures, where the joy of expressive release is a direct measure of how it happens in relation to other bodies in movement sound. In his concerts, the stage is filled most of the time not with musicians, but with dancers who rarely move synchronously as an ensemble, instead spending most of their time emulating the party culture. Puerto Rico is famous for a party culture of joy and release that is inextricable from the suffocating experience of the insularity and colonialism further cemented in place following the dismantling of a plantation society. I'm interested in how this work, and perreo more generally, speaking as a reflection of how, following the great Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter, a dancer herself, we can look to Caribbean dancers in order to understand how the colonized and enslaved retained an alternate humanity via a counter-modernist worldview, underscoring that one of the primary functions of Western modernity was to break man's relationship to nature, constructing this relationship as adversarial and one in which domination was an end. Wynter points to how these dances enacted a co-humanness by reestablishing this fundamental relationship to the earth through dance. In this, quote, rehumanizing of nature, the dancing established a relationship to the self as nature, quote, strengthening the forces of the earth, the fertility of the earth, and man, reaffirming the ties with ancestral spirits, the community, and the earth through the procession in dance. Okay, so seen in this way, what she calls these body rites performed, bawdy, B-A-W-D-Y, rites performed at the Grammys, plena, perreo, merengue, we weren't just dancing in non-English, but also in non-Spanish, in non-French, non-Dutch, non-Portuguese. I will wrap up, but I want to share one more thing. Our night at the Grammys ended with a bombazo. In someone's backyard in Inglewood. Beloved friends from the powerful Booyah group from Chicago who happened to be in town, our diaspora mapped in the multi-directional connections between the different players. In part, we went because we weren't all famous Hollywood Ricans, the endearing term we give to the group of Ricans whose migration to LA is pulled by the work of art, beauty, fame, talent, music, dance, movies, or in a word, the industry. But mostly because after performing for millions of viewers for just about 5 minutes, nos quedamos con la gana. We wanted to play, sing, vacilar. At one point, I made the comment that our batey that evening was the referent that the Grammys tried to capture, the thing itself, not a metaphor or a broad strokes gesture. Someone shouted, "Sin batey no hay Grammys," and then just as quickly, the guy who earlier that day had donned the larger-than-life likeness of Ismael Rivera turned it into a coro in the Holandés bomba rhythm. Sin batey no hay Grammy, ¿cómo lo disfrutamos? Ya.
Next up, we have Dr. Josiana Arroyo, coming from UT Austin. Let's give it up.
Buenas tardes. I would like to thank Arimar Bonilla, Cristel Justino, and Kimberly Roa for all the fabulous arrangements and organization for this conference. You see, it has taken a lot, and we're having an amazing time. Thank you. Thank you. In my short intervention entitled Bunny Caribeño, I would like to locate the Bad Bunny phenomena in dialogue with and discussion with the do-it-yourself technologies, the mediascape and the ethnoscapes in relation to the Caribbean and the global neoliberal script. Thus, I will put Bad Bunny in discussion with some theoretical concepts I analyzed in my recent book, Caribes 2.0, New Media, Globalization, and the Afterlives of Disaster, which came out in the Race and New Media series by Rutgers University Press. So the aim of Caribes 2.0 is to look, read, and deconstruct the media image and its interventions as an echo chamber where the racial image, including blackness, whiteness, and ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, dominate the discussion in television, but also in new media representations. While gender and sexuality, as we saw throughout these presentations yesterday and today, objectify, commodify, but also create dynamic scenarios where femme and queer aesthetics and emasculated masculinities and ratchetness are evoked. The aim of the book is to understand Caribbean-mediated bodies, artists and performers, and their critiques or refusal in relation to the neoliberal script. I define the neoliberal script as the ways in which contemporary culture centers itself around narratives of success, economically and socially, self-making and difference, be it gender, racial, or economic, in which the appropriation or representation of certain qualities leads to the theoretical primacy of the individual before the collective. Center in the ways capital has defined every relationship from the personal to the political in terms ultimately in the monetary nexus, the neoliberal script relies on an image of a body that is abled, beautiful, normative, entrepreneurial, dynamic, healthy, and young, all these things that Benito has, right? Although this categories vary according to gender and class. For queer folk, the normative is read through the traditional couple script, incorporating normative dynamics of whiteness and the middle-class family in a displacement of difference. The self is transformed into a product, and that product sells or capitalizes social power and acceptance. The fallacy of this script is that what is required for that social power needs to rely on an image, and also that these narratives of self-making have had, in many ways, a historical appeal throughout the ages. The neoliberal script relies on testimonio, or a form of bio or biography of these histories of the self to be completely effective. Thus, we are witness to these stories that rely on the illusion of the real. This is how celebrity culture, as we saw today, right, has defined the illusion of the real, narrativizing the subjects in terms of their economic participation in the dynamics of capital. However, whomever is outside or who does not participate in these networks, which makes them in many ways remains invisible in relation to these forms of neoliberal subjectivation. Caribes 2.0 engages with these questions of invisibility, but also hypervisibility in these ethnoscapes, and the binaries and dichotomies around race, racialization, and racism, as well as the violent spectacle created through them, either in collaboration or coercively. I maintain that the media images appeal to a regime of instant affect in the violent, spectral, and perverse dynamics of racial formations, which form different capitals in the so-called post-racial societies. I locate by Bunny, and this was mentioned before today, in what Frances Negrón Montaner reads as part of the Boricua pop screed phenomena that starts in the 90s in Puerto Rico, in relation particularly to his white passing Puerto Ricanness. At the same time, the fact that his body is not read as white in the global context, particularly in the US, and his refusal to cross over to sing in English make his uses of these ethnoscapes more significant. While he's ethnically white passing, he sings in Spanish and maintains most of his conversations in the language, a fact that creates an extra layer of racialized and stigmatized forms of representation. Puerto Rican Spanish is Afro-Hispanic. It's an Afro-Hispanic vernacular. So this is really important to think about, and I think Richard has comments on that later. At the same time, following reggaeton stars, he has made his accent and vocabulary global. In the creation of this ethnoscape, the blur between local Caribbean cultures and the respective archipelagos, a Latinidad, has become a critical point of creative contention. And when we add blackness to the core of the discussion, as we have seen here, we're faced with real contradictions. In Remezcla, Rafael Cepeda looked at this silence, right, when the Black Lives Matter movement went global, right, with the protest of the killing of George Floyd. But Bunny was conspicuously silent about this, and 2 months later, he made a statement in his interview for Time magazine on arguing, as we said, the quote, "I want to go deeper and see in what way I can serve, how I can support the fight against that systemic monster that has been around centuries." It is a problem, but he wants to contribute, and he says, with faith and freedom and justice, end quote. Given his collaboration with Black artists such as Cardi B, and I'm thinking mostly of Cardi as she has opened paths to many other artists and others, we still see that in many ways, not only the influential role of Black artists in reggaeton has been undervalued, but also Blackness remains a problem not only in Puerto Rico, but also when it's discussed with Latinidad. It is in this context that I want to discuss the ways Bad Bunny works as a global culture phenomena, whose refusal but also acceptance of this global script and representation of the local in relation mostly to the Dominican Republic and its diasporas. We could say this is a strategy for many artists today. Nevertheless, for Bad Bunny, it has created a level of success that pertains to the realities of the global world today, particularly in the US, where this is a world cipher, 62.6 million of immigrants speak Spanish as a first language. The do-it-yourself product is not a perfect product. It relies on imperfection, duplicity, and even error. What makes this product special relates to the ways it's communicated across platforms and technologies. The experiment made by Bad Bunny with his successful Yo Hago Lo Que Me Da La Gana, his second album and the most streamed in Spotify in 2020, has been tried by other artists before, but not with this success. I believe that the pandemia and the fact that we were all inside had a really strong influence in this. As I make clear in my book, Caribes 2.0, most of the aesthetics of crossing over into Caribbean global markets are defined by what I call, following the work of Wilfredo Burgos Matos, global dominicanidades. Thus, when we're thinking about the Bunny Caribeño, we need to discuss his aesthetics of amargue, which has been defined by Burgos Matos as the effective aurality not only of contemporary Dominicanidad through bachata, but also a way of reading misaligned passion or love, nostalgia, or emasculated suffering, and the masculinity and the migratory displacements from the campo to the cities, including, right, not only Puerto Rico, but also Santo Domingo and New York, all themes connected to his trap music. Bad Bunny starts working on his oral aesthetics through his creation of his songs highly influenced by Puerto Rican reggaeton artists, as we have seen here, but in dialogue with local influential bachata in a world that has been central in his music. We need to see the title of this conference to know this, right? Titi Me Preguntó is sample, as we said yesterday, from the Anthony Santos Bachata, No Te Puedo Olvidar. And also, then it turns to a furious Dominican dembow, why Fue de los Dos, the famous bachata by Leonardo Paniagua, is sampled in La Romana, for example. His producer, Marco Borrero, he's a Boricua Dominican from New York City. He's behind a lot of this sampling and this work. So kudos to him. And he is also kind of very connected to other crossovers of many other Black artists in the industry, particularly with Dominican music. We just think about Hot Like Bling, for example. That's a bachata in English, basically. It's also important to mention that his collaboration with women, his collaborations with Colombian Karol G and Cardi B were also really important, catapulted him to fame. I want to mention Cuba really quickly. Cuba has not had the same success with reggaeton artists as Puerto Rico has, particularly in relation with Benito, right? But Gente de Zona is also a collaborative group. It's the most successful group in Cuba. But they have not had, their Miami crossovers are kind of connected more to Puerto Rico in many ways, Puerto Rico, Miami, and other areas, right? So do-it-yourself technologies are related to temporality, but also to surprise and imagination. In December 2022, we filmed, we were actually in Puerto Rico, and we saw the concert in the Gulf Station with Arcángel. My daughter Leila saw the agglomeration in the street, and we look on Twitter, and I actually joke, oh, maybe Bad Bunny is there, and he was actually there. Right? So we changed from our PJs to comfy clothes and watched the concert for an hour and a half. Of all locals who were down on the street, an American woman who proclaimed herself a resident of the La Calle Loíza came in. She talked for us for half an hour to let us know that she did not understand why this artist was so important. She has been living there for 20 years. She told us at least that they should fill the holes in Calle Loíza and pick the garbage in the streets if we have people coming in. As she decided to leave and miss the concert completely, the three of us realized the irony of the story and why precisely Bad Bunny decided to pick up the spot to film with Arcángel, a local from the Caserío Luis Lloren Torres, just blocks from the Gulf Station. What is really interesting and what we noticed, and I'm going to wrap this up really quickly, is that the crowd was really divided. You had the crowd from Llorens coming from that side of the street, and then the locals and the tourists, that coming from La Loíza, more of the tourists on the other side. So Puerto Rican geographical dimensions of race and class were extremely intertwined into that presentation. So this is the contemporary Puerto Rico. In La Calle Loíza, many Dominicans have returned, have left the area. They have been displaced, but also local Puerto Ricans, while a mostly population of elderly people remain in the area, subjected to a lot of the tourist issues, but also to the noise, movement, and soundscapes of boceteo. This is a contemporary Puerto Rico we live in, not only in Calle Loíza, but also in Vega Baja, Manatí, Rincón, Aguadilla. The Puerto Rico of displaced Puerto Ricans who have to become diaspora Puerto Ricans, many of them, the elderly as well as the young. Was Bad Bunny's concert and decision of going there over a critique of all of these events, or was it kind of a wink to them? To sample this Caribbean from the Puerto Rican archipelago to a global Dominicanidad, but also to do it in Spanish as part of this Caribbean samplings with an 90s poverty visual aesthetic is the brilliant thing that we see in Bad Bunny. In a moment when traditional hegemonic left is in a crisis of authoritarianism and no vision, we have kind of like made Bad Bunny a kind of representative of a lot of our missed anxieties. I think this is problematic. We can discuss this later. As a phenomenon, it has now, as we see, his moment under the sun. But I do believe this moment is already shifting into new dynamics or realms as we speak. Thank you very much.
Coming up next, we have Ellie Velorio from Duke, a PhD student. You can start walking. Everyone give it up for Ellie. We support grad students.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, for everyone who organized the symposium. It's really exciting and very intimidating to be in conversation with the people that inspire and cite my work. So thank you so much for having me. And a special shout out to you, Dr. Bruno, for your mentorship and guidance. You've pushed me so much in the best way, for your creativity, and for helping me to problematize Bad Bunny and to think about his impact for audiences in a new way. So broadly, we're looking at, I'm working with Dr. Sarah Bruno on a chapter on Bad Bunny citational practice in the context of the history of reggaeton and his concerts as a digital space of map making. For this presentation in particular, I'm focusing on nostalgia as affect, and it's something that I'm still thinking through, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation in the panel, and I'm trying to approach it in two different ways. One, problematizing how Bad Bunny represents Puerto Rico as a leisurely space of vacation, and thinking about how digital content creators use fashion, music, and trends to articulate an early 2000s or Y2K aesthetic of nostalgia that I think aligns with the sound and concept of Un Verano Sin Ti. So my aims and guiding questions today are: what is the powerful role of nostalgia in the album, and what does that mean for his work as a Caribbean artist? How can ethnography illuminate partial answers to these questions? And what does it mean to long for an imagined romantic experience that you've never had? I think, and I know we probably all agree, that music, imagery, and aesthetics have the potential to elicit these emotions that haven't been lived but are imagined. And I'm building on some of the work that Angelica Negron brought up yesterday about field recordings that produce a sense of place through seagulls and crashing waves. I loved what she was saying about evoking texture, atmosphere, and nostalgia with the references and the memories. So I want to build on that to think about how this is reproduced by audiences through digital platforms, to understand nostalgia's affect, aesthetic, and practice. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of some ethnography that I've done, and then I'll move into analysis. Oh, no, it's okay. No problem. Sweat drips down my back in the crowded, stuffy, and hazy theater as my eyes struggle to adjust to the dimly lit room. I smell sweat, the lingering perfume of marijuana, and remnants of spilled beer. Outside, it is a freezing winter evening, but in this room, our bodies are meshed together, tight clothes cling to our bodies, and Bad Bunny is blaring on repeat. Tonight is Una Noche de un Verano Sin Ti, a traveling dance party that curates a Bad Bunny playlist with local DJs across the United States. I'm in Hartford, Connecticut, a predominantly Black and Puerto Rican city, where the crowd is mostly composed of Puerto Ricans who have gathered to drink, dance, and celebrate one of the archipelago's biggest contemporary names. The participants I briefly spoke with expressed a longing for a memory that was not something they'd experienced firsthand. As one participant told me, I'm half Puerto Rican, but I don't speak Spanish. So Bad Bunny brings me closer to my culture. And he makes really good music. I loved Un Verano Sin Ti. It was really good, it was a vibe. When I listen to it, I imagine I'm on a beach, end quote. And so for me, this was a really interesting conversation to have because the themes of sex, fun, alcohol, and the beach aren't necessarily new for Bad Bunny, but I wanted to think about what it means to paint the Caribbean, and specifically PR, as a leisurely site of vacation escape. In other words, what are the political implications of pleasure under colonialism? And when I think about Un Verano Sin Ti, this is really striking because I think about songs like Me Fui de Vacaciones, which help me think about how imagery and aesthetics and the sound of the album conjure experiences. For him, he was inspired to write about his nostalgia, family vacations. He wanted it to be a playlist for people to sing or to listen to at the beach. And so much of what constitutes the album are like references to TikTok, to being on Google Maps. He says Puerto Rico se ve linda en Google Maps. So digital spaces, it all comes out in the album. And so for an artist like Bad Bunny, who's from Puerto Rico but sings to a global audience, I'm really interested in how Puerto Ricanness is transmitted and articulated through his music. The sound of the album offers a chance for Puerto Ricans and members of the diaspora to recall the archipelago and temporally locate themselves on the island. Like reggaeton itself, diaspora gestures to the circuits and grooves of belonging and identity that are constantly shifting. And as I picked up during interviews, there are plenty of Boricuas, either children of people who moved or people who've left the island, who are listening and using his music to forge and maintain that connection. The Puerto Ricans I spoke to in Hartford expressed nostalgia for a vision of Puerto Rico that they didn't necessarily have or hadn't necessarily been to, but they were trying to capture and make visceral a fleeting experience of it. And what was especially interesting to me was that so many of the participants at this dance party were there because they told me they couldn't afford the concert, and this was the closest that they could get to that experience. Contextualized by the rising rates of gentrification displacement on the island, especially as foreigners are enticed by tax breaks and a romanticized idea of living in the Caribbean, I think this is an interesting tension to explore in terms of who can afford to access particular experiences in Puerto Rico. And so now I'd like to pivot to how an aesthetics of nostalgia plays out online and how listeners are creating that experience for themselves. If you were on TikTok or if you went to his concerts, you probably know, hopefully, what I'm talking about when I referenced the hashtag Bad Bunny concert outfit. This was how globally, this became a thing for people to show off their outfits for each other. And this is actually a really interesting phenomenon that I think is happening. We see with like Beyonce, with Taylor Swift, but with Bad Bunny, the idea was that you were wearing like tiny braids, low-cut jeans, colorful crop tops, glossy lips, lots of glitter, bikini tops, platform heels. It was like very Y2K, very like early 2000s, fun, summery, carefree. In an interview where my photos came from, people talked about wanting to capture that feeling through their clothing. So what I was really interested in trying to understand through digital ethnography in my future work is understanding how this aesthetic is reproduced and replicated online to kind of like bring it to life and embodying what I believe is an aesthetics of nostalgia in Un Verano Sin Ti. So to wrap up, the question I want to end with is, what's at stake when we consider nostalgic aesthetics in the context of the Caribbean? Nostalgia is a really powerful and seductive emotion. It can be mobilized both emotionally and politically. And I want to say, one of my answers, and that we'll probably discuss further on, is that in the context of the gentrification, displacement, as we're seeing corporations and tourism continue to take over in the Caribbean, especially in Puerto Rico, Some of you may have seen on TikTok a video of a woman showing off her favorite place to take a photo in Puerto Rico, and she was looking at a cemetery. We have a lot of people who are colonizers, neocolonization happening. And so when we think about nostalgia and we think about the continued environmental catastrophe, I want to understand how we can kind of use that nostalgia as a mobilizing force. Thank you so much.
So next up, we have Alexandra Sanchez Pronon from UPenn in Africana Studies. Come on up.
Qué lindo cantan, ¿no? Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. My name is Alexandra, and today I'm sharing a really small snippet into this central question that's bothered me since I was really little, which is, what is so vulgar about vulgarity? When your parent is like, no, you can't listen to that because it's too vulgar, but what does that mean? And so when we think of urban Caribbean music genres like reggaeton or dembow or even dancehall, we get these critiques of vulgarity aimed at their maybe oftentimes sexually explicit or violent content or lyrics or dance styles. But as we know, there's no such inherent thing as vulgarity. It's instead this reflection, right, of these Western modern processes that pretty much name anything outside the boundaries of Europeanness, whiteness, maleness as subhuman or immoral. But with these genres' sort of intentional choice of using qualities that we might deem vulgar, we might also consider that choice to reflect a pedagogical decision. Or as Carolyn Cooper would explain, the disturbance of this vulgar noise can, quote, be recognized as a profoundly malicious cry to upset social order. So while my project has also looked at Toquicha's music and Vybz Kartel's music as well, here I'm focusing solely on the end part of El Apagón, to say that perhaps vulgarity acts as a pedagogical practice, one that's disturbing, but also informative. And in so doing, it holds this tension where it's trying to, one, highlight how the present past of colonialism still circumscribes daily life, but also how folks enact pleasure to make living possible in the everyday. Now, this pedagogy is sensorial. So at 2 minutes and 27 seconds, as day shifts tonight, hundreds of people rush in to party at El Túnel de Oaxaca. So Oaxaca is located in Isabela and was built in 1904 as part of the American Railroad Company's expansion of the Compañía de Ferrocarriles de Puerto Rico. So the Compañía comes in at the late 19th century, trying to build railways to connect different parts of the island as a means to transport Spanish troops, military supplies, and when 1898 comes along, the US federal government absorbs it under the American Railroad Company and is now creating, right, the Túnel de Oaxaca as a way to transport not just citizens, if you will, but also agricultural exports, so sugar, tobacco, coffee. So when we see El Túnel, we should also be directed toward plantation economies, black and brown labor, but also the unending colonialism of both Spanish and US imperialism, and of course, racialized capital extraction. Now, this is emphasized lyrically as we hear Me gusta la chocha de Puerto Rico. And so at first glance, we might dismiss this as like vulgar nonsense since chocha is so freely used in our colloquial vernacular, at least mine. But in thinking of El Túnel, we can also read it as a kind of canal. And therefore, chocha might also speak to the ways that the Caribbean births the world and continues to birth the world. So, this birth is ongoing, as Antonio Benitez Rojo would say, and it's painful. It nonetheless is painful. But the use of me gusta adds this paradoxical pleasure, right? To enjoy Puerto Rico's chocha is perhaps to find pleasure in birthing and being born of plantation violence, because without it, ironically, Puerto Ricanness in all its pain and glory would not exist. All right, so now this paradoxical pleasure is made evident visually as bodies burst into dance. And in the context of Puerto Rico, the scene is technically vulgar, maybe not quite for the perreo, but I would say more so for its evident queerness. And so while the Puerto Rican government has somewhat made strides toward LGBTQIA plus equality at a juridical level, to be queer and trans in Puerto Rico is nothing short of dangerous. So what might this climactic burst of queered pleasure, juxtaposed by both the tunnel and the use of la chocha, tell us? There's so many interpretations. I'm just going to drop one for right now because we don't have a lot of time. But
one thing that I consider is this idea of political queerness that Frances Negrón Muntaner offers, which suggests that if queerness is this active choice of deviating from mainstream ideologies or binary norms, then Puerto Rico's continuous decision to remain un Estado libre asociado, somewhere between independence and between total colonization, but it's really just colonization, could be akin to queerness. And so this ambivalence here doesn't negate the violence of US colonialism, but instead allows for certain freedoms that neither statehood nor independence might provide. So in this way, the paradox of La Chocha comes alive to simultaneously love and hate being colonized, and therefore to love and hate being Puerto Rican. And so as we shift to our last part, as the song returns to its chorus, everybody joins in to sing, Puerto Rico está bien cabrón. And we all know, in its very traditional sense, cabrón is a vulgar word. But for our vernacular Spanish, we use it for anything. It's very ambivalent. It could be an expression of frustration, expression of happiness. You could just call somebody, hola cabrón, ¿cómo estás? It's very, very chill. And so in this sense, we have to read cabrón as both pain and pleasure, especially in the context of the tunnel. And when we use está, we are also talking about a temporary choice, whereas is or es has to do with permanence, something that is inherent. Here it's Puerto Rico está cabrón, no es cabrón. And so this use is so slippery. And therefore, the chorus implies what it kind of means to be Puerto Rican. Things are conditionally amazing, just as they are conditionally haunted by the present past of colonialism. An alternate future is possible, but for now we remain in the paradox, joyfully singing along to that chorus. And amidst the unceasing violence, what else can we do but enjoy that vulgar ride? Thank you.
Okay, real quick. I got like a minute and a half. So, I'm Dr. Sarah Bruno. I'm a postdoc at Rice. I'm originally from Chicago, the South Side, to be specific. I'm gonna use this as a quick meditation. It's literally under 2 minutes. I time myself. So, in my own work, I look at the embodied knowledge preserved and activated in bomba. I've been teaching classes on reggaeton for a few years, primarily focusing on Black, Latinas, and reggaeton, as well as hip hop. I use bomba as a departure point to shift the landscape about Puerto Rican history and geography into a Afro-Caribbean intellectual genealogy, right? So I'm taking what Jose Luis Gonzalez says at his word, that the first Puerto Ricans were like Black Puerto Ricans, and using that to think about how bomba was created on the edges, like Michelle Rose Trio says, on the edges, just how reggaeton mirrors that later on. Petra has written about in the underground, right? The edges of society. And I'm looking at that framework, and I'm wondering though, what happens when we let this Caribbeanness, or identifying as Caribeño, meaning like an Afro-Caribbean culture, echo itself as race or Blackness. And Isar Gadro cautions us and articulates this folkloric Blackness or historical African heritage as an aesthetic political rendering that erases Black Puerto Rican experiences. So I'm wondering, how does whiteness show up in the Caribbean? What does whiteness even sound like, right? How much can geography or claiming where we're from do for us? And how does this like emotionally affect us as all Puerto Rico is like living under what Tiffany Lataibo King is calling this conquistador colonialism, right? And so to close, I just wanted to cite Catherine McKittrick, right? She says we cannot risk exclusively and solely relying on metaphors or analogies or symbols as literary devices that advance our own argument about Blackness. We cannot drop Blackness into the realm of motif and depart, disguising the difficult and complicated life and extra literary worlds that animate and are relational to Black life. So those are my questions for y'all.
Things left over to say from the earlier part.
Then say that.
Other things that I wanted, but I think that also we've talked about so much, and one thing we haven't really talked about that I think is relevant to kind of gets at this question, Sara, but is how Caribeñidad signals Blackness for the rest of Latin America and how that functions through reggaeton. I mean, it has been, since for a long time, and reggae previous to that. But I mean, I think that's part of that circulation, right? So how does it mask its own whitenesses, right? Via its ability to kind of provide an entry point at Chocha to blackness, right? For the rest of Latin America. Yeah, y para el mundo.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for those wonderful comments and questions, Sarah. And yes, I agree with Jade. I think that particularly, in the case of the Caribbean, definitely blackness not only births all the communities we are in, but it's basically our definition. Many Puerto Ricans here in La Sala, know that recent debates about phenotypical blackness vis-a-vis afrodescendencia in Puerto Rico have been going on almost every day en las redes, right? And it has been a very contentious and difficult thing to watch because as it happens, mostly it's women, black women, that are involved in many of these debates, but also because there are a lot of hierarchies, right, in these discussions. And mainly what happens is that a lot of this, I don't want to say it, a lot of this Creole, but very traditional intellectuals kind of silence a lot of these voices. But I want to, since this is a very performative and centered panel, I want to make a comment. I think, thinking about that Coachella performance between Jose Feliciano and Bad Bunny, I think that it's interesting that in the level of musicality, that performance was completely off. For many, many reasons. First, because Jose Feliciano is a virtuoso of guitar. He was doing the requinto, which is a very traditional, but also it's a very syncopatic. Es un síncope, that comes through our Arabic, but also, Mediterranean heritage in many ways. And Bad Bunny was singing in clave. And then I think those two encounters, he remained with La Clave, and then Jose Feliciano was kind of going through this other. And for non-millennials like me, more older Puerto Ricans, we saw the tonal issue there. And I think this is a very significant aural, but also performative cue, hablando de clave, of these generations. And there has been a lot of debate about bomba, how bomba is becoming more white, et cetera, but these generations have been going through this transformation and exposure that has been enclosed to many of us older Puerto Ricans in many ways. And they are embracing it, right? And I guess we do need to continue talking about whiteness and the different types of whiteness, but we just need to also notice that there's a shift, and the shift is already happening in the new generations. And I see, not only Benito, but a lot of these new artists kind of doing it as well.
I've been stuck on the question of what does whiteness sound like? Because I'm what is the oral? Because then it also prompts me to think, well, what is whiteness? What is the whiteness that we're talking about? So is this purely phenotypical or in skin, or is this a position of class power, or what is this ephemeral kind of question? But I'm drawn back to Glissant because I really like Glissant.
Come on, Glissant.
And there's this part in, I think, Caribbean Discourse where he says something like, music that comes from struggle, that comes from the community, comes from the barrio, comes from the ghetto is really what he names, is struggle music. And so he's naming salsa, he's naming all of these other genres. And so to me, I wonder if what whiteness sounds like is when music gets folklorized and it's no longer on the ground, but now it just becomes sort of this top-down kind of creation that really doesn't speak to much more than just maybe commercialization at that point, which is complicated.
Can I respond to that really quick, just with an anecdote from earlier that came up in thinking about what you were saying about vulgarity, actually, because So I think one of the phenomena of Benito is also the kind of intergenerational, like, you know, like las abuelas y las mamás que lo escuchan, right? So, you know, after the Grammy performance, you know, mi mamá sabía y, you know, admiraba de lejito, whatever, but her, like, Puerto Rican pride with her mother's pride just kind of went on full blast, right? But some people, you know, the group of dancers, las comunidades that were connected to them, you know, they made kind of posts. And in one of them, it was like, we're so proud of the representation of our culture. And, you know, we're happy that Benito is representing our culture on the global stage. And then there was like, nota aclaratoria. We disidentify. We do not support his vulgarity in all the ways that he perpetuates what we deem the kind of, like, you know, unmaking of our society, right? So it's this, you know, this cruce that people kind of, that find themselves in that, right? What do you do? And I think that there's something about kind of making these other forms vulgar again, too, right?
So this question's for Jade, and I want to know your thoughts on the makeup of the dancers at the Grammys. Considering your analysis of the show, decisions on the dresses, the desire for authenticity of a Black Puerto Rican genre, and dancing in non-English, how can we understand the intentional decision to select non-Puerto Rican and non-Black Puerto Ricans to perform that night? Why not fly in dancers? Why select Mexican dancers to represent a Black Puerto Rican genre on such a big stage? I get this is part of the larger conversation on how Bomba and Plena are remade in the diaspora by non-Black Puerto Rican nor Puerto Ricans at all. What does this shift represent for the genre and culture, particularly in the West Coast, when Puerto Ricans often critique the lack of Puerto Rican representation, understanding, and about being assumed to be Mexican, albeit many of us are Mexican? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a complicated answer, but I mean, just like everyone who was, all the dancers, with the exception for one person, I mean, these are all real people, and these are all, like, you know, people that, I don't want to say too much, right? You know, it's important to critique the things we love, and it's important to also know when to not, right? But what I will say is that all the people that were in the kind of representing the Puerto Rican culture part were people, 99% of them were all Puerto Rican and diasporican. One person was has been living and engaged in Puerto Rican cultural projects for a couple decades. So that was how she ended up there, right? And in fact, when he asked, like, todo el mundo de Puerto Rico, everyone was like, don't say anything, don't say nothing. A ella en particular, pero con amor, right? I think that the larger question about, like, who it was is really complicated, right? And I think that, you know, kind of my reflection on how it was all put together was it was, you know, there were a lot of ways that it could have been much more intentional, right? I guess that's the answer that I will give, because it was ahí pasando rápido, you know, and in fact, the people that ended up where they ended up, it actually wasn't it wasn't actually selected. It sort of was very, that's how this work happens sometimes. It's very much like, oh no, tú para allá, okay, oh, we got a big okay, you two, you happen to be standing right there, so it's gonna be you, right? It wasn't even actually a practice of, and Gacho could perhaps talk to this, right? But sometimes these are decisions that you have to make, calls that you have to make in the moment, right? But because it also, you know, my perspective on that was like, wow, you can have all these people in the room that actually have so much collective knowledge, and including like a lot of collective critical knowledge, right? Like the people that I would have chosen to put in certain places and feature for the different kinds of, you know, politics of representation, and also frankly, just like how they perform, right, and how they move. I think that it's like there's a lot of different ways that could have gone down, right? And like what we saw was what we got, but in part it was a snapshot.
Just want to make the comment that I really love this panel, and I love every single thing that you guys have presented. I appreciate all of your perspectives, seriously. Y también, a very important point was brought up in regards to blackness, how it's discussed, the Twitter wars, the very difficult conversations that are being had online, some of which are very unfortunate. So in which case, I would just really love to hear your thoughts in regards to any solutions or ideas for solutions in regards to these conversations, because they're taxing and they're distracting, and they really take away from the point, which is, yes, Blackness is often erased, it's often put to the side, it's often put on the back burner, which eventually hurts everybody, right? Because what's that phrase? When Black people get a little bit, everybody gets a lot. So in which case, no, I would just really love to hear your thoughts in regards to that. And again, thank you for everything you're saying.
Yes, I just want to start saying that that's the taxing problem of social media on the one hand, but also the way the echo chamber and digital platforms are constructed and built, right? People engage with many of these topics, and they don't understand that there's real people on the other side, right? So attacks are virulent. They are monologues instead of conversations. And I know, because we discussed this last evening, you have been a source of many of these attacks. And it's emotional labor, it's taxing labor. And what happens is that you end up, instead of educating the people that you're trying to advance, kind of like suffering attacks. So it's taxing on your emotional well-being and health. I'm not sure, since the platforms do not necessarily allow to have real conversations. What I usually do, and when these things happen personally to me or to other peers, right, is that I just disengage. I just take many health days from the platforms, and I separate myself. I mean, and it's important. It's important because the face-to-face labor and the community labor you do on the side is usually even more central and important to many of these other conversations. Many of these people that come into these platforms are paid. I mean, and I don't want to go into surveillance right now, but the left is paying them, the right is paying them, I mean, from all sides. So they're trolls. So they actually come to get you. I mean, this is the way it works. I mean, sometimes it's not even a person that knows you personally. They're just being paid, and they are just to completely destroy your peace of mind. That's exactly what it is. So basically, I mean, and yes, we have this commitment to Blackness, this commitment to education, this commitment to advance knowledge, but at the same time, we need to protect our personal space and health. To me, the solution is to engage with real community, face-to-face, ethical proposals that are, I mean, and learn. I mean, for example, my students, I mean, I see them. I mean, they are a community of learners, and we engage in face-to-face, non-hierarchical modes of knowledge and collaboration. And so to me, that's what really works.
I'll just echo that I think that practice is really important, right? I think that aquí estamos hablando un montón, and I think it's really important to also do things, right, and to stay connected to practice. So I teach classes oftentimes that are cross-listed between like the interperformance studies and ethnic studies, and it's really interesting, right, because the ethnic studies students know the discourse, right, and they know how to like name it and call it out, and where the theater and performance studies students are like, metiendo la pata todo el día. But the ethnic studies students are too afraid to do anything, right? They're too afraid to feel anything in their bodies and make themselves vulnerable to each other in that way. And I think that kind of, part of the thing about social media is that we're not in a face-to-face embodied, we're not on the dance floor, right? We're not, and to Karina's point earlier about, and this is actually the part of the paper that I cut, but the call to Yo Perreo Sola, I think is actually, I kind of question that in some ways, because it's this idea about this bounded sovereign selfhood. We could interpret it that way, but I think that the actual it's actually about the freedom to be and do, and not the freedom to own, right? Even yourself, right? And I think that's what Winter's talking about. I think that's what the relationship to the land is about. I actually really think, and I'm just gonna I'll say what's on my mind and then I'll stop. I actually really think that the palma and the playa and the pleasure and the leisure, and I totally hear what you're saying about a place that you don't know. But when I saw that in the Un Verano Sin Ti concert, and maybe it was the half gummy I ate, or maybe it was maybe it was watching this, maybe it was watching it in the night that Hurricane Fiona was landing. That was la noche que me tocó ver el concierto de Bad Bunny, was when so I was thinking about the dancers, I was thinking about him. I was also in a like 99% Mexican audience, yo vivo en la frontera, gente de Tijuana cruzando. It was a surreal experience when I saw him walk out with his neverita and sit on that beach. Se me van a parar los pelos. I'm like, wow, that is about. This is my playa, and I can enjoy this playa. This is about place. This is about sovereignty. This is about relationship to land. And esos son that's the only memory that he will have, because now he lives in LA, and that means of that, right? He can never go back to that. We can't ever go back, right? But that enjoying the land so in a way that others come to vacation, right? I think that is extremely powerful, and I forgot what the earlier point was, but I just wanted to slip that
in. So my question is, and I want to hear from y'all, what do you think about when he says, la capital del perreo, ahora todos quieren ser latino? Because obviously he's referencing Medellin. I mean, I took it at face value, but all my friends were, no, he was trying to say, todos quieren ser caribeños, right? And I'm trying to tie this with the idea of nostalgia as well, because in a moment where Colombian reggaeton was sending down the black aesthetic of reggaeton, and we had like Karol G singing A Ella in a really popish kind of string-centered way, then Bad Bunny comes, yo hago lo que me da la gana, and like chat like in reggaeton, right? He took the stage and said, this is how we're doing reggaeton now. And now you hear Karol G, I mean, not to this, I love Karol G, right? But she's, not to diss them, right? But there's a certain replication of what Un Verano Sin Ti was, even with the album cover and everything. So yeah, I just want to hear from y'all that type of like bringing back blackness into reggaeton and tying it, like how he uses perhaps nostalgia to kind of ground that. I don't know.
Does anyone know what the lyric before the one that you just quoted is? La capital del perreo, ahora todos quieren ser latino. ¿Me fue después? Ah. Ok. Ahora me da tiempo para pensar.
Yeah, I don't think blackness has ever left reggaeton. Like, it's always there, will always be there, because like blackness is reggaeton. So I feel like that's something that Sarah has really called me out to the earlier question of how we hold ourselves accountable. Like, as a non-black person, like I have had to do a lot of education, and it means being okay with being uncomfortable and saying like, yeah, like I need to call myself out on my own shit and be like, yeah, like this is the privilege I have in many ways. And so when we're thinking about citational practice, that applies like academia citing black women, but it also applies like in music, thinking about like all the ways that Bad Bunny is constantly sampling black artists and not always crediting them. So I'm really curious to hear what other people say, but my answer would be blackness has never left. I think that Bad Bunny hasn't always been the best at recognizing that. I think sometimes listeners, right, like I think that was kind of my point. As I'm someone, like Spanish is my second language, so I practice my Spanish by listening to Bad Bunny. So I've learned a lot about like my culture. I've learned a lot about Spanish, about reggaeton through his music, but like he is building on a whole lineage that I think when you continue to engage that, you see that like this is what he's building on, this is what he's chasing on.
I also want to plug the chapter for the Bad Bunny reader, right? Because we talk about the sampling as like a type of citation, which for me, I was like critical of Bad Bunny, but then I was like, oh, he's done the reading. I was okay with him, I wasn't like, oh my God, I'm a stamp. But I was like, okay. I was like, he did the reading.
Yeah.
And that's when I really liked his music, because for me, that's when he brought the tra back, you know? So I feel that. Do you want to answer it? And then we could go to Yarimar.
Yeah, my mind is on the beginning of what you had asked, which was, what does he mean? Que todos quieren ser Latinos. He's talking about Latino or Caribeño. So I'm asking, right, like, what comes before that? Because the imagery in the video, right, El Sol está ahí, and then we have the flash of Diego Salcedo that then quickly goes to El Perreo Combativo. And then after that part of the, which you just mentioned, then there's a Pero le falta sazón, batería reggaeton. So in my head, regardless of whether he's meaning Caribeño or Latino, because I can't know for sure, but I'm thinking about the aspect of struggle and how maybe everybody wants to be whatever they think Latino is without having that struggle. So batería is also the percussion, which could also link us back to that blackness, but it also could be batería de no tener electricidad. So then, like, if you aren't in the struggle, if you aren't trying to fight every single day in whatever that means, right? Then what really is perreo, what really is reggaeton, what really is being Latino or Caribeño. So I don't know, but that's what I have to offer.
Yeah.
Ah. Bueno, me enseñaron algo.
Todos quieren ser Latino was a Tego Calderón lyric that he sampled and then disassociated from, which I think is something that we have to think about. So, vine a joder con esta pregunta. El panel es Bad Bunny Caribeño. Is, Un Verano Sin Ti was a concept album, right? He leaked little videos, like there was definitely like the whole beach vibe, this is what I want to bring. Is his Caribeñidad just like a concept for one album? We don't see the same Caribeñidad in all his other albums, and what he's been putting out since, especially 1%, is leaning more towards a broader, more generic Latinidad. Just want to hear what the panel thinks about that and how that might impact the way we engage with his vulgarity, right? A lot of people are saying that now the kind of references he made about La Chocha de Puerto Rico, etc., like with his current shifts, might not be accepted and applauded in the same way or celebrated in the same way in Puerto Rico. So was it Bad Bunny Caribeño just one concept album, or is it really something that we're going to keep thinking with?
No sé si te voy a contestar la pregunta, Yarimar, pero I think it's like it comes. I think it really is about place in a lot of ways too, and I think that Caribeñidad is about, place and movement across the Caribbean. And I'm thinking here about bomba, right, and how bomba. And just to be clear, because I gotta say it, no se bailó bomba en los Grammys, se bailó plena, se tocó plena, no se tocó bomba en los Grammys. Nosotras muchas somos bailadoras practicantes de bomba. There was a slippage with how big the movements were, pero lo que se va. And si nos va a importar eso, pero es parte de nuestra educación, right? It's part of our actual, like the specifics of these traditions matter. They're not like just metaphors, right? So I think in the same way that, so something like bomba, which has a very nationalist history attached to it, bomba es música caribeña. And it is music that was brought by the movement of enslaved peoples from other islands, and we know this because there are sister genres across the Caribbean, right? So to actually claim bomba as this like cosa puertorriqueña is powerful, but it asks a lot of bomba, right? In some ways, right? So I think about El Caribe as a place of movement, as a place of migration, and also as a place of localities, right? And so I think that the Bunny Caribeño emerges from his relationship to like the local in many ways, and I think that his moves to LA and to Southern California es otro ambiente, I mean, besides being Hollywood, it is, the biggest Salvadorian population, punto, es Mexico, so it's now he's in a different locale, right? And that's actually how he's coming into, I actually think that's how he's coming into his understanding of Latinidad, is not via an idea of it, but actually via a kind of like emplacement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will definitely agree with you. The local is really important. And the other thing that I wanted to imply in my reading is what type of caribeñidades are we talking about, right? They are not only many locals, but many caribeñidades. If you're talking about the one that is traveling through Miami, that's one, right? It's a pop caribeñidad that has other accents, other groups, other peoples. If you're talking about the one in California, is a displaced migration of mostly laborers and workers, like the one in Connecticut, but they took like 3 trains to get there. It's a very different caribeñidad. It's a majority. It's not even, I mean, I know my Puerto Ricans in LA, they have been there for decades. But they relate to all these Hispanic signifiers in a very different way. And I see this in Texas, as someone who lives in the Southwest. I mean, it's very typical. You get even Caribbean students who don't know too much about the Caribbean, and they resent discussions about race. They don't even identify as brown. I mean, yes, and this is a reality. To me, it was a complete shock. Coming from teaching at Berkeley as a grad student and then going to Ann Arbor, Michigan, when you got very political students, like here, you know, who stand up and talk about their own identity very strongly. Over there, that's not the case. I mean, at least in Austin, it's very dismaying sometimes, even in ethnic studies programs. I had complaints of my class. Oh, this is another course about race. And I'm like, that was in the syllabus when you added the freaking class. What are you saying? This is another course about race. Hello? It's in the syllabus. You read it and you came into the class. I mean, as if that is a problem because they don't have the language to discuss, whiteness, not even blackness. So don't you ever think that blackness comes naturally. But in relation to Caribbean peoples and bodies, I agree with Jay that this moment in California, and I think he's doing a really smart move. I mean, what he's doing with Grupo Frontera and what's happening now, I think it's a very smart move. It's coming from his producers. I think he's not going to abandon this amargue Dominican, / saudade feeling. I mean, this is the nostalgia. When we discuss nostalgia, we are talking about all of these elements that come not only from blackness, but to me also from our very, very diverse Mediterranean backgrounds. I mean, this is a reality that we cannot erase, and I think it's part of what he's doing, not only with the sampling, but also with embracing the Dominican sound, which I think is kind of like a really already pushing the global stage in many ways.
No, I just wanted to comment on the Caribbeanness or the Caribbean part of it. I'm not an anthropologist, as I forgot your name.
Ellie.
But I think as someone, I went to the garden for the Por Siempre, and then I went to Brooklyn for the El Último Tour del Mundo, and then the first night at Yankee Stadium. So, in a nutshell, I went to 3 of the 5 boroughs of New York, and it was really a different crowd, right? The garden was 2019 Bad Bunny. It was like much more wide crowd in the garden. Then Brooklyn in March last year was heavily Ecuadorian, Peruvian, and then Yankee Stadium was, 80% Dominican. And I have to say that first night, the biggest applause, and if someone can correct me here, was when Romeo Santos came out. So it really felt, and I think I was surrounded by Dominicans. The guy next to me, he cried. He cried. He said, "I've never seen Romeo," and then he hugged me. I have a video. He's from. I live in Washington Heights, and I think all my neighbors really swear that Bad Bunny is Dominican. They know he's not, but they own it. And I think he has this symbiotic relation. And I think I just wanted to mention that because the crowd responds differently to different things, right? So that's one thing. And then a quick comment, someone mentioned the intergenerational aspect. And I think one of the things that I've been grilled about Bad Bunny is that I wrote something about after the Choliseo concert. I dedicated to my daughter, who is a Bad Bunny fan. And then it was like, you're the worst mother on earth because, you let her listen to that vulgarity. So the whole discussion about, we haven't talked about that generation. I mean, my daughter goes to a dual language school in Washington Heights. Teachers play Bad Bunny. Some turn it down with the bad words. Others, they're from other countries, so they don't know what chocho or bicho is. So they're just let it go. So, but in the other parties, this is what they play. So that's the life of a elementary school in Washington Heights, and yeah. So that's fun.
Wow. My question is also tied to Alexandra's presentation about vulgarity, and I love the deliberately cheeky, pun intended, idea that this is a cry for upsetting the social order. And I think you've already started to do this, but I wonder, how do I have this conversation with my mom? And we've brought up misogyny, but we haven't really danced there yet. And I wonder, when we dance to these things and tied to, I think Karina was saying earlier about kind of the freedom, and something I think Cacho touched on yesterday was part of what the fight is this freedom to be free to dance and be vulgar, but we haven't really talked about sex a lot. So I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific about the diction and sex and misogyny.
Sex in what sense?
Te lo dejo a ti.
Tell us.
See, okay, the first question is, how do I talk to my parent or just somebody who stands at a different place? And the first question is, do you need to have that conversation? Because at a certain point, it just might not be worth it for whatever reason that is. But maybe my tongue-in-cheek reply, if it were somebody that I know or near me, no, apaga eso que eso es vulgar. ¿Qué es más vulgar? ¿Lo que está pasando en el mundo ahora o lo que está diciendo esta persona? So when I was looking at, let's say, Toquicha's, Sistema de Patio. Have you all seen this video? There are so many bullets just around, no guns firing, but guns, bullets, drugs, sex work. And so on the one hand, it's no, eso es vulgar, apágalo, que los niños no lo vean. That's another conversation. Pero a la misma vez es una realidad. So the conditions that make this possible have nothing to do with individual persons, technically, right? These are systemic issues. So to me, I just be ¿qué es lo peor? What really is vulgar in this moment? What made this happen? Or somebody just saying chocha? Or somebody just fucking? It's not, to me, it doesn't have to be that deep. But at the same time, those are hard conversations to have. And sometimes they're just better left. Tú haz lo que tú haces, y yo pienso lo que yo pienso.
Yeah, I'm just gonna leave it, specifically to the music. I think Bad Bunny is already an intergenerational artist. Look at the crowd here. Look at the different decades. And this definitely happens because of all of the local, as Jay was saying, but also of the brilliant sampling of his music, right? There's bolero, there's guaracha, there's song, there's salsa. Everything is mixed there, and the lyrics are there, and we identify with this music, but also, and particularly in relation to dancing and joy, right? Dancing as joy, dancing as freedom, dancing as Jade was saying, right? A being big and occupying space, and understanding bodies, right? Their diversity, multiplicity, but also their sovereignty. It's to me kind of really central and important. About music in general, not only Bad Bunny's, but just the joy of music. And I have a lot of problems with people that call vulgarity all the time without even getting into the, well, they're not going to get into the space to kind of analyze anything else. And once you call vulgarity, the conversation is closed. It's like once, and I think you were discussing that with many of these artists today in your presentation. I mean, the conversations need to happen, but I agree with you. They don't need to happen necessarily within family members or your parents or the people you want. I mean, you don't need to explain yourself. You just live. I mean. This might be generational too.
That's important. And like, faltan los chiquitos, right? Like, los chamaquitos, they're not here. And that's a big, like, los chamaquichichiquiwikis. I think about the questions around, like, intergenerational, vulgarity, sexuality, and you know, I'm glad you brought up sex work, right? Because censorship and all of this makes the inherent violences of these practices worse, right? They make them more violent. And this is kind of why I think the rhetoric of Yo Perreo Sola is really interesting to me, because it's about like, can the creeps just leave me alone on the dance floor, please? Like the patriarchal reach of women's bodies, and also, you know, especially racialized women's bodies. But at the same time, you know, there's a kind of, in the kind of rhetoric of that phrase is which is the other side of it, is like, pero no me dejes sola, right? Like, you know, and I think that this is the kind of the messiness of sexuality, right? We can't be in a place that's safe of violence, right? Like, there could be violence here, right? You know, like, there probably is, you know, and we can never assume that, and just because we said it doesn't necessarily mean it, right? And so I think that to think about the messiness of our you know, porosity to each other, right, is dangerous, right? And I think, but also this is some of the language that we have now that we didn't have in earlier generations around consent. But even consent is something that oftentimes is placed back onto the individual, right? It's like the individual's responsibility to give consent. It's not our collective responsibility to handle these violences, right? So I think that we can't, you know, the question about vulgarity and the kind of, you know, acoso sexual that we all know very well, and if you love to be on the dance floor, you definitely know it. You know, how can we get away from that, and at the same time not lose the very important technologies that these bailes caribeños nos dan, right? And the kind of the tools that they give us to know each other and live a better life.